Welcome to the third session of the Disability and Philanthropy Forum's Journey to Inclusion series, brought to you by the President's Council on Disability, Inclusion, and Philanthropy. My name is Emily Harris, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of the President's Council on Disability, Inclusion, and Philanthropy. I come to you from the land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi Nations, now known as the City of Chicago. As a woman who is hard of hearing, I'm proud to be part of the disability community. As part of our commitment to accessibility, our speakers and I will each provide a short audio description of ourselves. I'm a white woman with dark curly hair, wearing rectangular glasses, and a blue shirt with a multicolored choker necklace. Behind me is a screen made of rectangles of blonde wood and white paper. A few housekeeping items for today's learning session. The recording of today's session will focus on the speakers and the moderator. There may be one or two moments when we show gallery view. Feel free to leave your camera off if you have any concerns. You will receive a link to the recorded parts of this session in approximately 10 days. The slides during my housekeeping remarks highlight what I'm saying. We have live captioning today. There are two ways to access these captions. Use the CC button at the bottom of your screen and choose subtitles or full screen. Or there is a stream text link now in the chat. We ask that everyone participate in the Zoom poll that we are now posting. The poll today concerns demographic tracking and self-identification. This Zoom poll can be accessed by screen readers. If you're using a screen reader, to navigate the poll, tab to the title, Demographic Tracking and Self-Identification. Click Enter, tab to the list of questions and answers. Use the up and down arrows to answer the question you wish to select. Hit spacebar to check your box of choice, and tab to the Submit button and click in order to submit your poll answers. The poll will remain open for several minutes while I share some more housekeeping notes. We'll show the results very soon. During the first portion of our program today, we will be spotlighting our speakers, and you will be muted. Next, there will be a Q&A session. You can place questions in the chat, and our moderator and speaker will address as many questions as we can. We'll be using the chat to share links to information, and you can use it to post questions at any time. You can also send questions to assistant@disabilityphilanthropy.org. We'll start the initial Q&A after about 45 minutes of discussion. Please note that even if we run out of time to answer your questions, they will inform the resources we create on our website, the Disability Philanthropy Forum, disabilityphilanthropy.org. Check back early and often. We understand that some people have a hard stop after 60 minutes, and we'll conclude the formal program by then. We're trying something new with our format today and adding an optional conversation from 1 to 1:30 Eastern Time for those who can stay. This will be your time to interact with the panelists. We'll continue during that time to take questions in the chat, and if the group size permits, we also invite you to go off mute and share your questions verbally. The program will wrap up no later than 1:30 Eastern Time or even earlier, depending on the audience's interest. Before I highlight our moderator, I want to highlight a few principles. First, disability is a natural part of the human experience. There are more than 60 million of us in the US alone. Disabilities can be apparent or non-apparent, lifelong or acquired. And disability identity is only one part of each person's identity. We represent all aspects of diversity. Second, like other forms of oppression, the barriers to inclusion, full participation in our society are socially constructed and can be dismantled if we are intentional. Finally, we recognize the founding disability rights and justice principle, nothing about us without us. Today, you'll hear from Chai Feldblum and Cathy Martinez, both of whom are leaders with disabilities and experts in the issues and dynamics of demographic tracking and self-identification. I'm particularly excited about our session today because we have just launched the Disability Inclusion Pledge, a series of commitments for philanthropy. To date, 43 foundations and philanthropy-serving organizations have signed on. If yours has not, please see the link in the chat and encourage your CEO to join us. Today's learning session is meant to directly address one of the pledge priorities, that foundations begin to measure how many people with disabilities they employ and how many serve on their boards. And now, let's take a look at our Zoom poll results so that we can learn a bit more about all of you. To the question, does your organization include disability when collecting demographic data about staff, 50% said yes, 20% said no, and 30% don't know. To the question, does your organization ask grantees to report on disability as part of the demographic data it collects from grantees? Again, 50% yes, 27% no, and 23% don't know. Your role in philanthropy, we have 10% of you in executive leadership, 27% in program, 23% in grants management, 7% in human resources, 7% in information technology, and about a quarter in the big category of other. Thank you so much for sharing these results. It really helps us to know who our audience is. Without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator for today, Mona Jhawar, Senior Learning and Evaluation Manager with the California Endowment, whose role involves various inclusion initiatives, including oversight of TCE's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Audit. We're thrilled that TCE is part of the President's Council and that Mona has been an integral part of our Research and Learning Advisory Group. Mona's bio is in the chat, as are all of our speakers. Mona, you're on, and again, everyone should please feel free to use the chat at any time during the discussion to post your questions, and we'll hold them for Q&A at the end.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Emily. It's really great to be here. I'm so happy to moderate today's incredible panel. We have a ton to dig into, so I'll just go ahead and jump into my introduction and I'll try to keep it brief. Hi, folks. As Emily mentioned, I'm Mona Jhawar, Senior Learning and Evaluation Manager at the California Endowment. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. And my accessible audio description is that I'm a brown Indian American female with hazel eyes and long dark hair. I'm wearing a red, black, blue, and white floral blouse with gold hoop earrings, and I'm sitting in front of a white wall. I'm based out of TCE's LA office, which is located on Chumash, Keech, and Tongva lands. I'm really excited about today's conversation. Like many of you, I too am on my own learning journey as it reflects and relates to disability inclusion and disability justice. And I'm really grateful that we have this space to be in community together so that we can be vulnerable about what it is that we need to understand more, and so that we can learn together and to ultimately consider how we create pathways to change philanthropy. Right now at TCE, we're in the throes of developing our next strategic plan that leverages what we've learned over the last decade in partnership with grantee partners and other leaders across the state. And moving forward, as we continue the pursuit of health and racial equity, we're deepening our commitment to building power and systems transformation across California. With respect to disability inclusion, we've long recognized disability as one of the multiple identities that people can hold, including our staff and our board and our partners. And our DEI audit that Emily mentioned helps really to keep us accountable and has always included a specific goal around disability access, including accessible communication formats. That said, we're also working to update our audit to reflect our deepening equity commitments. And we're also working to improve our demographic tracking overall as well. So as someone who helps to hold different parts of this work, I'm really looking forward to learning through our dialogue today. So to that end, I am really honored to welcome our experts and advocates, Kathy Martinez and Chai Feldblum. Please check out the chat to read their full bios. And I'd love to invite you both to share more about who you are. And Kathy, I'm wondering if you might want to kick us off by introducing yourself.
Sure, my name is Kathy Martinez. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am Latinx. I am blind. I'll do my best to describe myself. I am a woman with dark hair, becoming more salt every day, more gray hair, shoulder length. I'm wearing a paisley shirt, a burgundy paisley shirt with blue and yellow and white. I have a blurred background, and I am currently sitting on Ohlone land.
Beautiful. Welcome. Thanks, Kathy. Hi, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Thanks so much. And it's lovely to be here as part of this event. My name is Chai Feldblum. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I have blonde hair, at least it's blonde hair now. And I am wearing a blue shirt. And my background is a set of books and pictures that, to be honest, I've put together as a backdrop, given that we all know that we need those now. I am sitting in the land of Nintego, which is now known as the state of Delaware. Oh, and I am a white woman, which is what you can see. I'm also a lesbian, which you can't see. I'm also a person with the hidden psychiatric disability of anxiety disorder, which again, you can't see unless I self-disclose that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Chai, and welcome to you both. Really appreciate having you both here and really excited again about this dialogue. And now that we've finished our introductions, let's go ahead and dive in because I know that there's a lot that we want to cover together. Let's start with self-disclosure. Chai, you were helping to model that as well as Kathy too. And I wanted to start with this question around your lived experiences. And I'm wondering about this question from your perspective and your lived experiences. If you could share why and when someone may choose to self-disclose their disability identity.
Want to go first, Kai? This is Kathy.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
Oh, Kathy, did you say you wanted to go first?
No, I said you. I said
should I go first? Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I think, excuse me, this is Kathy. I think, Mona, it'd be helpful to call on us sometimes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, I'm happy to.
Otherwise, we'll always defer to each other. I mean,
right.
Kathy and I know each other for a long time.
We know each other for
Fair
a very
enough.
long time. So.
And I do think for those listening, in whatever form you're listening, that it is, I think, helpful that you're hearing from one person with a non-manifest disability and someone else with a manifest disability, because I think we take different journeys
Yep.
to self-identification. And have to deal with different types of societal impacts. So for me, when I was 29 years old, I ended up being one of the lead lawyers drafting and negotiating the ADA of 1990, and then again, the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. And it was very important in 1990 and then explicitly in 2008 to make it clear that disability included a full range of physical and mental conditions, including those that were not, quote unquote, traditional disabilities. I think in 1988, although I was diagnosed with anxiety disorder in 1989, and have had it medicated since then, I don't think that I necessarily self-identified as a person with a disability then. However, by the time that process ended, I realized, yes, this is what I had been talking about. You know, I am part of the disability community. Now, because it's not manifest, it's not something that I was open about for most of my career, or early part of my career, when I was a professor for 18 years at Georgetown Law School. But because I was doing disability rights and I realized the stigma around psychiatric disabilities, I started, in any speech I was giving, even if it wasn't a speech about disability, I would come out as a person with the psychiatric disability of anxiety disorder, because I wanted to message the fact that we're all part of, so many of us are part of the disability community. And to be honest, after each speech, someone would come up to me and say, thank you for saying that, either because they had anxiety disorder or depression or some other psychiatric disability, or they had a child with that disability. So that has been my personal experience.
So
Over to you, Kathy.
thanks, Chai. So it is good that we have very different points of view and experiences. I am blind. I could not hide my disability. I was raised to try to be, quote, normal, which meant that until I was in college, I was not encouraged to use a cane, a white cane, or any kind of identifier as having a disability. Now, I will say that I think the discrimination against people who have evident disabilities and people who have non-evident disabilities is very different, but equally as painful and real. In my experience, I could not hide. What I did not do was come out as a lesbian until, you know, my kind of mid-career. I was really afraid. So we have that in common with the LGBTQ community. In many situations, we're the only person with a disability in our families. And some of us, as Chai was mentioning, you know, don't necessarily have to come out. You know, I decided at some point that I wanted to bring my whole self to wherever I was. And so that's when I started coming out. I would say my experience, you know, it again is very different. People react to me with a lot of fear. I think they're afraid to, you know, imagine what it would be like to be me. People have said, I've been, you know, no matter kind of how far up the food chain you get, even as an assistant secretary, you know, I would be with people and they would basically say, gosh, it must suck to be you. So I think the discrimination is very different, but it's nevertheless very real.
Really appreciate that, Kathy, and Chai, and you sharing your personal stories in this process as well. And what I'm hearing both of you really reflect on is the importance of really making evidence the connection to being a part of the disability community for multiple reasons, for yourselves in terms of acknowledging fully who you are in connection with other parts of your identity, as well as making your presence known so that others can connect as well, and to really normalize the presence of disability within our community. So really sincere appreciation for you both sharing your stories, and those themes are really evident. And they also really highlight the connection between self-disclosure to additional topics that we want to explore. So shifting from the idea of when and why someone as an individual might want to self-disclose, let's also talk about the organizational perspective. When an organization works to understand who makes up their staff and board, why do you think it's important to include asking about disability? And I might also add to this question, given the focus in philanthropy right now on equity, if you could also speak to how understanding disability really connects to deepening an organization's commitment to equity, I think would be really helpful as well. So why don't we go ahead and start this time with you, Kathy?
So I think that given we're in an amazing kind of nexus point around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in so many cases, people are including disability as a diversity dimension. Not in every organization, but as a person of color, I believe that disability is, it impacts me in a very different way. I know that in my community, there's a higher incidence of disabilities for lots of reasons. High injury jobs, bad healthcare, immigration status. There's just levels of diabetes. I don't want to get into the laundry list, but there's a big connection in my mind between racism and ableism. And so as we go through our processes of inclusion, as Emily said, disability is a natural part of the human condition. I believe, I really hope that folks on this call and whoever listens to this recording do encourage people with disabilities to be a part of their teams at all levels, not just at the entry level, but I think we also have to search for each other, because it's, we're not part of the mainstream recruitment process yet. So I think there has to be a targeted effort to find people with disabilities and recruit and promote and cultivate, that acceptance and the systemic change that needs to happen. For somebody like me, it's very different than I think somebody with a non-evident disability. When you hire me, we have to think about communication access and accessible applications. I think this is an amazing opportunity for foundations to really put out the welcome mat, so to speak, and find qualified people with disabilities. We are out there. I can tell you that having worked at a corporation for the last 6.5 years, we were able to find folks who were very qualified and really, wanting to be part of the various teams.
Really appreciate that.
So I think it's such an important question, right? Why should you be asking people whether they have a disability, right? This is your employees, your volunteers, your grantees in terms of their employee, volunteer, board member positions. Why should you be asking it? And what will be the impact, the positive impact if you ask? So if you ask people if they have a disability, you are communicating to them that it matters to you to know whether there are people with disabilities, again, among their employees, volunteers, board members, all the way up the food chain, as Kathy said, that it matters to you. I think you are also communicating that you don't think there is stigma in answering that question. Mm-hmm. So, for 9 years, I was a commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, which enforces our civil rights laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's a form that any employer with more than 100 employees has to fill out, the EEO-1 form, which asks about gender and race. It does not ask about disability, does not ask about sexual orientation or LGBTQ status. I and others worked very hard at the commission to argue why the EEO-1 should be changed. It hasn't, at least not yet. And then I spent the last 2 years working at a law firm of Morgan Lewis, helping companies and organizations increase their diversity, equity, and inclusion, and answered many questions from companies and organizations that said, oh, it just seems very private to ask about disability or LGBTQ status. And they were not just focused on that it seemed private. They were really saying it seems private and it seems like something people would not want to disclose because it carries stigma. And my argument back was always, look, as a lesbian, I liked if you're asking whether people are LGBTQ because you're wanting to know whether people are out LGBTQ, someone who's not out just will prefer not to answer. As a person with a hidden psychiatric disability, I feel seen if you ask about disability. And that was a really different mindset. So why should you ask? Because you're sending a message that it matters to you, and you're sending a message that you don't think it carries stigma to self-disclose. And then what will be the impact? Number one, hopefully you'll get more people with disabilities applying because the word will get out that you care. But then also, as Kathy said, which is so important, that people with more significant disabilities often require changes, right? Someone who's blind is you're gonna have to ensure that all of your systems are accessible. Same things for people who's blind, same thing for people who are using wheelchairs. You need to potentially make changes in a way that for people with a hidden psychiatric disability of various kinds, you just need to make sure that they have time off to go to, medical care, that they get other accommodations that they might need, but it's going to be less. So you will send a good message and you'll make good policy changes internally.
Hi, this is Kathy. Can I just say, I would just slightly disagree that the accommodations are going to be less. They're going to be different.
Yes.
And I think we have to make that very clear, is that they're not less and they don't mean less. And it's still a systems change to change policy, but they're definitely different.
Yes, I take that totally as a friendly amendment to what I was
Absolutely
saying.
meant it as such.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thanks for jumping in with that, Kathy. And really just appreciate where this conversation is going. The acknowledgement of the multiple isms that we get to address when we bring to the surface who it is that we are working with within the environments that we're in, and how ableism and racism in particular interact. And especially as so many foundations are really thinking hard about how we help to move equity forward, this I think becomes so critical for us to make sure that those intersections are explored and really made evident through this kind of work and through deeper analysis. And Chai, really sincerely appreciate what you're also raising around how communicating and asking about disability status when we're looking to collect information about our staff really communicates two specific things. One, that our full identities matter, including disability, and how the process might destigmatize the presence of a disability as well. So really appreciate that. And what I'm also hearing really loud and clear through both of your comments to this question is the idea that by asking questions like this and by being really clear about the full gamut of demographics that we ought to be collecting, that this is also a way for us to prompt action within our organizations. And from thinking about accommodations, but also thinking about the policy and systems changes that we can help to move within our own foundations. And I'm curious if there are other actions that you think having this kind of disability data will help to prompt in terms of additional actions based on the experiences that you've had. I'm curious if that might be something you want to comment on as well. And this time around, why don't we start with you, Chai?
Okay. So, and I think this is really picking up from the conversation that we've started. So, number one, there's a real problem of low expectations for people with disabilities. I mean, that's just a reality, even if people are not going to admit to it. You know, it's like white people needing to self-educate themselves to understand how we have just absorbed racism, right? Or we are part of structural racism if we're not combating it, right? It takes self-education to come to that understanding. That's certainly been the case for me. as a white woman over the past year. So the same thing should happen with disability. And I think it's hard for people to confront their low expectations unless they're actually working with people with disabilities who are blowing up those expectations. Someone told me a story once, someone who uses a wheelchair and he was pumping gas, and another person who was pumping gas said, "Wow, good job." Good job? I mean, this is clearly someone who thinks, we never thought that person who uses a wheelchair could just pump his own gas. Well, would they think that that person could be a VP running a whole system? You know, probably not. So I think it really makes change if people are open to that self-education, which means the leadership really has to make sure to facilitate that, making people uncover their own myths and stereotypes about people with disabilities. So I think that's one huge impact. Lots of others. So I'm going to move over to Kathy to talk about some others.
Well, I think I would just want to stick with the low expectations, the tyranny of low expectations, as some of us call it, because in many ways we're trapped. And I mean, I think you know, we all experience this. If we are, well, no matter what dimension we are, but I think disabled people particularly experience it. I also believe that, you know, I completely forgot the question. I'm sorry. Can you just tell me what it was again?
That's okay, no problem, Kathy. We were picking up on the theme of how disability data can be used for actions and systems change within an organization. Yeah.
Right. So again, it allows, first of all, understanding that, you know, people are a part of this other dimension, I think is very important. I think the data itself, you know, can essentially be used to prove that point and to prove the point that people with disabilities, when given the opportunity, can contribute and you know, be part of the team. I think Chai is right. Once you work with a person with a disabilities, and you kind of mix it up, and you know, you're working on a project together, there a lot of, you know, we fear less what we know best. So I think a lot of fear, low expectations, you know, doubt, all that kind of negative stigma. I won't say it goes away, but I think it changes. I know working out of the disability bubble, you know, I saw it happen very gradually at my last employer. And I think, you know, it does change people. And what I hope is that, you know, that they will then see that, you know, we are, I don't want to use the term just like everyone else, because I that's not a good term, but, you know, we can contribute, we can be a pain in the ass just like everyone else, and that we can be also part of the team. And I think that's something that to me was so important as a person with a disability. You know, I helped folks out, they helped me out. And the data, I think, just says, as it grows, that people with disabilities are welcome and have, you know, and have a stake in the work and have something to contribute.
And Mona, if I just want to add another piece to that. Number one, it is the case, like I always say, people with disabilities are as talented and as mediocre as people without disabilities. Right. I mean, people are along a range. But the other thing, in terms of why would you want to collect the data? Well, obviously, because you want to see where you are in terms of representation right now, and you want to increase that representation. I mean, I think that's the thing people think of right away. So I think that's why it was sort of important to start with other impacts. But obviously, that's a major impact. And you want to see where you are in your representation, up your level of leadership, not just people who are in lower level jobs. People with disabilities are often unemployed, but they're also underemployed. They're employed at a lower level than their actual talent and capacity. So you want to see up that representation, including particularly on your board, as well as your senior leadership. And again, I think once that happens and you have representation on the top levels, that will help make you an organization of choice for people with disabilities who see that there is a place to rise. And I want to tell one other story, because even though you don't see this person on the screen, but Emily Ladow is part of this team. And I will never forget something that Emily posted on Facebook. This is like 4 or 5 years ago. It's like the wheelchair, gas story, but Emily posted that she was coming back from a trip and she had, we always have a suitcase, the roller, the other thing on top of the roller, her handbag. She's going into the elevator and someone says, "Oh, let me help you. Let me help you." And she's like, "No, I'm fine." And like the woman's like, "Let me help you." And it's like Emily's thinking, how do you think I got from point A to point B? It's like, yeah, now I'm in the garage. It was in the garage, elevator. I, I think that just says it all, and I think we just need to increase the representation so that people can then see that actually you can be at a high level. And once we all start flying again, that we can manage our luggage.
Really
Yeah.
appreciate that. Hi. Kathy, did you want to jump in?
No, I was thinking about, the importance of leadership. I think it just doesn't work if your leadership is not invested. And I have been lucky and unlucky because I've been around leadership. I work with leadership that really, thought, oh gosh, this is going to be a pain in the ass. But I've also worked with leadership like Secretary Solis and Tom Perez, who not only, believed in bringing folks with disabilities into the department, into workplaces themselves, but really made, really modeled how we did it for the Department of Labor. And it's really easy to tell folks what to do, but then, when you start doing it yourself, you have to think of things like, how do we include people with significant disabilities? How do we include people who are not just at the entry level positions? And we all have many stories of where people, thought we shouldn't be in places, or we were given jobs because we're disabled or out of pity or some bizarre, idea of, oh, well, did you just get this job because they thought it was the right thing to do?
Kathy, really appreciate that, and really appreciate where this conversation is going, because you've provided a beautiful entryway for our next topic, which is in thinking about the culture of disability inclusion. And so we've covered the ground of thinking about data collection and why that's important for the communication that helps to convey across an organization, but also how it helps to counter the tyranny of low expectations, to really have the expectation that we will not only be able to bring in and work with people with disabilities at multiple levels of the foundation or any organization, but also that it's really critical to establish a baseline so that we understand what our organizations look like now, so that we can think about what kinds of recruitment need to happen and how to make our environments more welcoming. So on that topic of creating environments that are more welcoming, let's dig into this idea of what it means to have a culture of disability inclusion. And Kathy, let's continue digging in to your experience on this topic, particularly as it relates to your experience at Wells Fargo. I'm curious about what you think we in philanthropy can learn from that experience that you had there around helping to encourage self-disclosure, thinking about promotion and recruitment, and really ultimately trying to create a more welcoming environment.
Well, I want to include my experience at the Department of Labor too, because I ran, the Department of Labor had one office specifically for people with disabilities, but our goal was also to get people with disabilities employed in other parts of the agency. So I think there's a few things to think about. there's the physical access. Can a person, get in the building? Can they access the applications and software that they need to do their job? There's that part. And then, there's the culture. So I always get asked, well, what's the best training to, what's the best training we can use to, to hire people with disabilities? And we've all said this, the answer is hire a person with a disability. We have to start somewhere. It is not going to be a perfect road, and we shouldn't expect it. I mean, nothing is perfect. Wells Fargo had 250,000 employees, many of whom were outside the country with their own ADA law or similar ADA laws like India. And we also had, millions of customers who needed to access our products. So it was a big swath that we had to deal with. But I will say that the journey for me was very positive because first of all, we had leadership that was invested in making the change. And it's not always easy because, you have IT people that are saying, well, if you make your IT accessible, then we're going to have security breaches. There's sometimes can be a lot of pushback. But how we started was just talking about disability. We created a community of practice, a recruitment community of practice, and it started out really small. And I was very discouraged. I'm like, oh my God, what did I do? But it got huge, and so many hiring managers started to come. We had, we had presentations. We had every imaginable panel you could think of. I refused to be the only spokesperson for the bank. That was something that I had to say, I am not your token, and you do not want a token. You want different perspectives. You want to talk about evident, non-evident disabilities. You want people to be able to ask questions, and you want people to be able to, people are going to make mistakes. It's not going to be perfect. And we have to allow that to happen as long as we're seeing improvement. So, I could go on forever. We really beefed up our accommodations, our accommodations program, to make sure that people could be onboarded in a positive way, which is very important, and most of all, I would say that the big change was that we were as a team, as a giant 250,000 person team, we were talking about it and people were getting hired. So it was like lifting all boats. So as we hired people in different teams, they had to deal with, that person. And very often we hired people with significant disabilities. And we hired folks at all levels of the bank. So we hired people in IT and HR and, in digital. So, the idea was just bringing more people in, having conversations, and then more people self-identified as the years went on. And I'll stop.
It's incredible.
I agree with all of that. I would just add one thing, because actually I know we want to get to some questions if there are questions, that creating a culture of respect overall is essential. And that's a culture of respect for everyone. I spent a year at the law firm of Morgan Lewis, sort of helping to refine training, respectful workplaces training, to create what's called a psychologically safe workplace. And psychological safety, based on the research, is actually the most determinative factor for an effective organization. And in a psychologically safe organization, people feel safe coming up with ideas and feel safe coming forward with problems, and they feel safe making mistakes. So that creates a psychologically safe workplace. And that also means people coming forward with who they are. And there are some sort of skills and tools that you can teach about work respect in the workplace, generally for everyone, and then application on how that affects in terms of race or gender or disability LGBTQ status, etc. So that would just be my one addition on the culture point.
Perfect.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. I really want to just kind of underscore what both of you are sharing in terms of culture, especially around this idea of just not being afraid to jump in, right? And I think, Kathy, what you were really highlighting, I think so clearly for us, is that we can learn from experience, and the most important thing is to start the conversation and get to a point where we're going through the experience of really working to change the organization that we work within. So sincere appreciation. We
Can
have
I just, this is Kathy.
Yeah.
I just
jump
want
in.
to say everybody you hire is an experiment, whether they have a disability or not.
Fair enough.
And that is just how it is. Yeah, so that's my point.
Yeah, love that. And time is moving by so quickly. I can't believe we're already at a quarter to the hour. And we have a number of different questions we still wanted to get through this dialogue, but we have a number also coming through the chat as well. So we're going to take a minute to pivot to some of our colleagues' questions. And so let's go ahead and dive into a couple of them. One question came in around noticing that many great disabled experts work as consultants. Why do you think that is? And what can we do in our organizations to attract these highly qualified people? So
this is
Kathy,
Kathy. I am not a consultant. I'm currently working for an organization. But I think, as Chai said, people want to feel welcome, they want to feel respected, and they want to feel valued. And I think, to attract somebody, that you've got to lead with that.
Yeah, and query whether someone is a consultant as opposed to a full-time employee, because they're not getting hired at the level that they're really capable of operating. And as a consultant, they don't have to be hired by someone else. They're doing the work themselves. But I actually am I'm sort of not necessarily aware of that as a statistic. But I certainly think there are lots of people with disabilities who are consultants. You might want to hire them as a consultant and then actually hire them as a full-time employee if that's what they want.
Yeah, fair enough. Love that. We have a couple questions coming in both through the chat and I think another source as well that focus on how we collect demographic data in particular as it connects to disability status. So let me read a couple of them. For those of us in HR, how and when do you ask for demographics, including disability, race, et cetera, in the hiring process? And are there legal implications? So let's talk about that question from an HR perspective. And I see another question as well that's come in through the chat around really thinking about the process of collecting demographic data and the most respectful ways to ask someone if they have a disability. And is it simply enough to ask, do you have a disability, be it seen or unseen?
So I think I'll start with that. Let me just start with the legal piece and let's blow up a myth, okay? It's not illegal to ask either applicants or employees if they have a disability. Now, under the ADA, however, you need to make it clear that you are asking that information because you are trying to make your workplace one in which you have hired more people with disabilities. Okay, you have to actually say that. Now, well, you don't need to say that if you're also asking about, let's say, race or gender in terms of the law. It's a good idea to start any survey with, here's why we're asking this. And it's voluntary for you to answer. Here's why. For disability, once you make that why clear, you can ask as a legal matter. Okay. Then in terms of how to ask it, one way to do it is to say, do you have a disability? And if so, would you like to identify what type of disability it is and have an open text field? The thing is, a lot of people still have a vision of disability that's very limited, right? The whole point is they don't see disability across the spectrum, and that if they have depression, that would count. If they have, diabetes, that would count. So it's useful to explain in an opening paragraph how broad disability is. But again, because partly you want to have people feel safe about self-identifying as an individual matter. I mean, in that survey, everything's anonymous. You're just trying to get overall data. So it's useful to describe how broad disability is. I also think it is useful to try to collect information on people with more significant and manifest disabilities. Because again, as I've said several times, the societal hurdles can be harder in terms of employment. As Kathy said, it's not something that she can hide, right? So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EOC, when it asked federal agencies to collect data and try to reach certain goals, had a separate goal of 12% for people with all disabilities, because there are so many people who fit that, and then a 2% target of people with more substantial disabilities. So legally, you can ask it. You can ask it in these sort of more specific categories. And, hopefully people with hidden disabilities, who again, it's all anonymous, might feel more comfortable coming out.
This is Kathy. I think Chai answered the question.
Oh, Mona, we just lost your sound.
Uh-oh. Well, I do,
how about
There you
that?
go.
I do have something else to say about that, though. And I learned this at the bank more than I did anywhere else. Because at the Department of Labor, even though we were trying to get folks in other agencies in the department, I was still in the disability bubble. But what I found at Wells is that people with non-evident disabilities that came out in the 6 years I was there would tell me, like, it is such a relief to not have to hide. And I know, you didn't really ask this question, but to me, the human side of coming out, the stories were just incredible. Sorry, guys, I have like an eye infection, so forgive me.
No worries.
And that part of working, in a place that was, that I did see change, and I saw a lot of folks with non-evident disabilities that disclosed, not only disclosed, but came out to their teams and their managers, because you can disclose on paper, but then when you can identify, and then when you disclose, that was a big weight off them, which I found, just amazing, and how they expressed it to me, was just like, I don't have to lie, I'm not hiding this part of me.
Yeah, I really appreciate that what seems like a somewhat simple act in terms of asking can really have such profound implications, both for a person and what they hold, as well as making changes within an organization. So really appreciate that, Kathy. We have a couple minutes before we open ourselves up even further, and I wanted to continue to dig into this question about what we ask about, because this is a question that we, I think, get a lot, and I think a lot of folks are really struggling through right now. So to complement, Chai, what you were talking about in terms of how we go about asking questions around disability, can you also talk a little bit about the utility of collecting information about specific disability type, and what we might want to consider balancing, and what we might want to think about there?
Yeah, so again, I really want to do as a framework, recommending that the HR folks, the other folks who are thinking about asking these questions, to let go of the idea that someone may not want to say, I have this disability, and to really understand the concept of disability pride, which is, you have it in gay pride, right? The idea that I'm fine about telling you actually exactly what type of disability I have, right? Because I'd like to blow up the stigma that someone with bipolar disorder can't be a reliable employee, right? Or, yeah, I'm fine about saying that I'm blind, or that I use a wheelchair, because that's going to be useful for you in terms of your data collection. But again, the template question that I would recommend is one that simply asks more generally first, do you have a disability? You can either do just that broad one or have your list of more substantial disabilities, and say, do you have any disability on this list? But then give people the option of to say in a free text form, and this is the particular disability I have. And then the same thing in terms of the broader definition. That's why I'm saying you have a paragraph up front that basically lets people who've never self-identified as a person with a disability, just because they have diabetes or some other medical condition, to now realize that they should answer that question yes, when you say, do you have a disability? Now, again, that's not going to serve your need of sort of reducing stigma of some of those hidden disabilities, unless someone decides to go from that anonymous survey to actually self-disclosing in the way that Kathy just described. But, if it might be of interest for you to see how many people have psychiatric disabilities, if they're willing to self-disclose that. So I'm a big believer in giving people the opportunity to say what type of disability they have, but also a big believer in not setting up a survey where they have to do that.
Yeah, this is Kathy, and Catherine Townsend just put something in the chat, which is a good point, which is that some people have multiple disabilities. I also think that, like, for example, when you hire a certain number of a certain type of people with disabilities, the economy of scale will let you know, like, for example, gosh, well, we really do have to make our HR software accessible. Because I know what happens at some companies is if you're the only print disabled person, or if there's only 2 of you out of 250K, they'll say, well, we'll get you an accommodation. And that accommodation may not work for you as well as having the whole system accessible. But the company will say, but it's too expensive to retrofit the system, so we're going to provide you an accommodation. And sometimes the accommodation won't work, but they're legally within their rights to do that. So if let's just say that if company X, discovers that we've hired, 100 people with a print disability, then it might make sense to really looking at retrofitting, an HR system. So that's one reason to track different types of disability.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy and Chai, on this topic. We are getting to the hour mark, and I wanted to invite Emily back on screen with us to share a little bit more about what you can expect from this series overall.
Thank you so much, Mona, Chai, and Kathy. This is amazing, and this is one of the best moments in this webinar, because usually I have to say it ended too soon, but we can continue for another half hour. So please do stay, lots more time for question and answers. But we did want to remind you of a few things. First of all, there will be a survey popping up on your screen whenever you do leave. Please fill it out and let us know what you thought and ideas for future topics. Speaking of future topics, on October 21st, we will continue this conversation about disability in the workplace. So plan to join us then, as well as on September 23rd, when we will have a discussion in our Disability and Philanthropy series on disability and climate change with MacArthur Foundation CEO John Palfrey and 3 dynamic disability climate justice activists. Also, a few other things. Please do, if you haven't yet, join the Disability and Philanthropy Forum. Tell your colleagues to do that. It's free, and you get notices of events like this. We are having our first ever conversation, and Chai and Kathy maybe can talk a little bit about the value of ERGs in the corporate sector employee resource groups. On July 13th, we are inviting anyone who works in philanthropy, who self-identifies or is a champion of disability inclusion, to join us to launch a cross-foundation employee resource group called Celebrating Disability Across Philanthropy. And we would love to have people join us for that. And finally, if your organization has not signed up for the Disability Inclusion Pledge, please see the pledge webpage on disabilityphilanthropy.org. We will now go back to Q&A, and in addition to adding questions in the chat, if you would like to come off of mute, we will continue to spotlight our panelists, but you are welcome to come off of mute, and our tech team will find you, spotlight you too, so you can ask your question as well. So Mona, Chai, and Kathy, let's continue until questions run out or it's 1:30 Eastern, whichever comes first.
Sounds great. We do have another question that did come in that we can tackle, especially in this current moment. I think it's really appropriate. Here's the question. So with so many businesses reopening, what needs to be considered regarding self-identification? And does a post-COVID, hopefully, world environment affect identification and tracking differently?
You know,
great.
I'm sorry, my computer was blowing up. So could you read it again?
Yeah, absolutely. Here's the question. With so many businesses reopening, and what needs to be considered regarding self-identification? And does a post-COVID work environment affect identification and tracking differently?
This is Kathy. That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I think that on your, recruitment job announcements, encourage people with disabilities to apply. I would also recommend that you, develop a statement about, if you're having difficulty with our online application, please contact so-and-so for, an accommodation, because a lot of the online job portals are not very accessible. And that's on, like Oracle and the people that create these. Yeah, I think a consideration people are we're gonna all have to deal with are the disabilities that have been created by COVID. There's folks that are, I think the term is long haulers. I don't know if that's still acceptable, but folks who have had COVID and are still having symptoms, and still dealing with disabilities that they acquired through COVID. I think that's going to be a big deal. I think how we work in general has changed, period. Everybody is struggling with, a hybrid model of returning to work. And, what does that mean? Is that considered an accommodation, or is that just standard operating practice? So I think there's a lot of questions that, that we're going to have to work out in the next year.
Yeah, I'm also very glad the question was asked. I think it's very timely, and my responses are actually coming from the almost year that I was working full-time at Morgan Lewis. I've left. I'm just a consultant to them on certain projects, but advising employers during the time of COVID was like a huge part of the practice and the continuing time. So I think it's really important to think about what you're going to consider as an accommodation, for example, for someone who wants to continue working from home, versus what you're going to think about as simply the normal way of doing work. So you're not forcing someone to ask for an accommodation. Okay, it's really the best way for our society to be set up is that the background norms of our society should be developed with the idea of everyone who's in our society, not just develop with the idea of certain people, and excluding people with disabilities, right? So many people with disabilities may not have asked for the accommodation before of working from home. Now they can
Mhm.
see not only can they do the job well, but it's actually easier on them for whatever reason. To have an employer then say, well, I want everyone back in the office. And now the person has to decide whether to self-disclose and ask for the accommodation. If the employer can think, do I really need people to come back in person? You know, obviously some people, yes. And then that would be an essential qualification of the job to be there in person. But, you know, when I ran this entity called Workplace Flexibility 2010 from 2002 to, it went till 2010. I went on the EEOC in 2000, early 2010. But we always used to say, just do a pilot project of workplace flexibility, changes in schedules, having people stay home. Well, we've all had a national pilot project
Right.
across the board, and let's learn from those lessons. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other is some people who may not, let's say you do want to have people come back. I think you really also want to send the message for people with disabilities that you have an obligation to provide an accommodation, that it's totally fine for them to ask for it, to really reinforce. Someone who is someone hard of hearing was telling me how Zoom meetings were actually better for him because it was one person talking at a time and he didn't have a lot of the background noise because people were on mute. You know, that's something that someone might not have realized before, and somehow sending the message that if you discovered that something was better for you, let us know.
This is Kathy.
Really
I will
appreciate
say, we're working it out in my current organization, and so many people with disabilities, including myself, who had very stressful commutes for whatever reason, find it just easier. So I'm assuming that we will consider working from home as not an accommodation, but people can, as part of our standard operating practice, and people can choose a number of days they want to work from home. I mean, that's sort of my idea of a hybrid work model, because it did work in this particular organization. It did work. People did get their jobs done. And for so many people with disabilities on the staff, it just made things so much less stressful.
Right. And another thing to add to that is, again, based on the research, there is often a utility in having people together. Part of the
Right.
diversity piece is
there
often
is.
putting ideas, back and forth. Certainly for younger people, it's very helpful to be mentored by someone who actually comes to the office. Okay, and that should be considered part of the job description of someone
Right.
in leadership. So there are reasons to sometimes have people together, but focus on those reasons, because that could be achieved by having a day in which that's when we're going to do our all staff meeting and everyone will come in. I don't particularly like the idea of core days, because then people begin to think that, oh, I don't have to come in on the other days. And obviously you want to make it clear that if there's some reason why people have to come in, then they have to come in, right? But if you focus on the reasons why you want people to come in, I think you're going to come up with a better policy.
Agree.
such a timely discussion for this moment. And it's super helpful to hear your perspectives. We have another couple questions that have come in, and I love this next one. So you spoke about disability pride, and can you talk more about how understanding your rights under the ADA can add to a sense of empowerment, and how might that lead to self-disclosure? I wonder if you might want to kick us off.
I was about to turn it to Cathy first on that. I'm happy to, but I just think, Cathy, in terms of Eric's, I really have more of I have legal and some individual experience, but let me let you start.
Well, this is a very good question. And I would have never thought this had I not gone out of the disability bubble and worked in a corporation. But since I have a bit of a different perspective. So disability, there is a disability culture, and it's growing. Not every person with a disability is a civil rights advocate or activist, but I think that's changing. I think understanding your rights is critical, but I also think that, again, being around folks with disabilities, believe it or not, we can even mentor people that are non-disabled. And people always assume it's the other way, right? But I think that being around in a company where there is a sense of, where there's a respect for difference and people do understand their rights, and it's clear that there's respect and value for people with disabilities. And I'm going to go right to the ERG question, because our ERG, our team member network, grew significantly, in the time that I was there, and that sparked a disability pride. Now, there was, that team member network consisted of people with disabilities and allies and parents of kids with disabilities, caregivers. It was a very broad swath of constituents. But I think that just knowing that your company, values people with disabilities, and there's a system, that people can work through if they need an accommodation, or if there's a way to talk about disability, and there's a way to be comfortable with your disability or someone else's disability. I found that really enhanced and promoted disability pride from within, the ERG. And that kind of, it trickled out. It's like success begets success in that regard. So I think that understanding your rights, being a part of a group where you feel comfortable, and having conversations all contributed to the disability pride that people felt.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Kathy, you and I both have this experience of you often within the disability bubble specifically, me certainly within the civil rights bubble my entire life. And then I know I surprised a lot of people 2 years ago when I went to a private law firm, a management law firm, because it just seemed so quote unquote out of character. But for me, it was about where do I make the most impact?
Exactly.
And
Yep.
I definitely felt I'd been doing all this work thinking about how to prevent harassment is where I started, before it started. And so therefore I talked to employers who wanted to take proactive actions. But I feel I also learned so much over those 2 years that I wouldn't have even known, in terms of what are the challenges, what are the opportunities. So to the question of the utility of learning your rights under the ADA, I think that is key. And I think you want to make sure that you have HR departments that are not afraid to put out the information about the rights that people have, which, by the way, will also help level set expectations
Right.
from people who think that they can get any accommodation they want, which is not the case. And for the people who quote unquote misuse the ADA, and I certainly have seen some of those examples, that doesn't help people with disabilities who need the ADA. So I think putting out information about one's rights is really important, and HR folks should not be afraid of that, or organizations in general, many of which don't have an HR department. But certainly your grantees may not. But you modeling for them how to put out a description of those rights, or providing some almost service for them, here is a template of how you can do it, I think will be helpful. And then again, picking up on the ERGs, I love that, right? I mean, we all know success begets success, disclosure begets disclosure.
Right.
And if you're in an ERG, and especially if there's someone who's in a higher level within the organization that has self-identified, that and has made it clear that by self-identifying, you might get some accommodation that will make you work even better. I mean, back, Kathy, to your point, people with non-evident disabilities often don't disclose, especially psychiatric disabilities,
Right.
when in fact they could have an accommodation that could let them perform better and therefore move up higher in the organization. So So I think ERGs are an important source of both building pride as well as informing people of their rights.
This is Kathy. The other thing I'll say about ERGs that I found super exciting, in not just at Wells, but in other companies that I've spoken to, is, once you have ERGs, the next step is to bring them together to discuss commonalities, how they can work together, how they can support each other, how they can be allies. That's the next step, in pride, because then we take pride in each other's identities as well.
Mhm.
I have one other story about ERGs that is interesting. So I came on to the EEOC in April 2010, and as it turns out, I had promised my spouse that I would drive with her. She was teaching at UCLA that semester, and I had promised that we would drive the car back together. Okay, because I thought I would have been on the commission already for some time. I was nominated in fall of 2009. So I was not going to back off of that promise. Not good for the marriage to back off of that promise. So I was going to do a road trip. And I thought, well, why don't I do a road trip and stop at EEOC offices across the way and actually meet with the ERGs, especially the disability and LGBT ERGs, And I mentioned that to my colleague, Commissioner Stewart Shamaro, and he looked at me and he says, "Hi, there is no disability ERG at the EEOC.
Oh.
There is no LGBT ERG. There is
Oh, wow.
for, Black employees, Latinx, gender." And I'm like, oh, well, that's a problem. Well, you know what? Within 2 years of me being there, there was both a disability and LGBTQ ERG. And I think that, people realized, hey, we're missing that. So.
Yeah, and this is Kathy, and I don't think, I want to be really clear. Me being at Wells Fargo I was kind of a stepping stone to a goal. I was surrounded by people who were desperate to, to get stuff going. So I was the excuse, right? They hired me to lead their disability strategy, their disability and accessibility strategy, but I was kind of like oh my God, she's here, now we can really do stuff. And there's no way you do this kind of thing alone. There's no way. And so I will, hats off to the folks who really believe that this should happen. And, it is imperfect. I mean, like I said, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But when people see change, at least my experience was they were pretty stoked about it and pretty happy to jump in and be a part of it.
Beautiful. Let's stick with this theme of intersectionality, because we have another question that did come in, and I think this is a great time to pick up on it. So we talked about how racism and ableism interact. With a real fear of racialized ableism, are there considerations HR should think about in the hope of getting disabled people of color to self-identify? I think we started talking about this, but
wow, that's a great, I think about this all the time. Yes, I think there are concerns, but again, if you see your people in the midst, then it's easier to identify. It's easier to come out.
Yeah.
I have experienced, given that I have to come out, I mean, I don't have a choice, but I know that people of color, in all different parts of my life that do have disabilities have been more afraid. I know that when I came out as a lesbian, the first thing my mom did was, freak out because she's a Catholic, but also, she said, don't you have enough hard roads to deal with? And my answer, of course, was, well, I don't have a choice. But so much, the conversation is, look, I'm already I'm an African-American, I'm Latino, or I'm Native American, I just can't, I can't identify right now. If you're somebody like me who doesn't have a choice, well, that's a different situation. But yes, I think it's something we have to consider. It's a process. It's like you don't want to out someone who's gay if they're not ready. It's very similar. But yes, I think there's a huge fear to come out if you don't have to. But I've also seen the other side of it when people do come out. It is a relief in many ways.
Yeah,
Appreciate that, Kathy.
one of the most important things, again, it's back to the messaging that you're sending.
Right.
So if you are sending a message that you understand intersectionality, that it is different, it is things build on each other, right? And we are all part of multiple identities. Not all of our identities have been subjected to stigma and discrimination, but all of us would understand that we are made up of multiple identities. So if the message is sent that it's understandable that if you're already dealing with stuff as a person of color, you may not want to come out as LGBTQ. You may not want to come out with your hidden disability, and sort of to understand that, but also the message of you do want to bring your full self, you do want to be who you are. Again, picking up, Kathy, on your point of the people who felt relief in coming out. And certainly I have found within the gay community, while it's still very hard for young LGBTQ people in certain areas of the country to think about coming out, often their fear of the response is more than what the response actually is. That there's often more support than they would have imagined. And I think that's probably the case in terms of disability as well. So I think we cannot underestimate and fail to understand the impact of the intersectionality. We just have to, but then somehow try to send the message that is understood.
Mm-hmm. Well said. We have another question that I received that helps us go back to the topic of accommodations. And I think this will be among our final questions, given that we're getting close to time. And so here's the question. How should organizations think about giving people with disabilities choices of accommodations or items to help address specific needs versus a take it or leave it approach? For example, just giving one option that can go right back to stigmatizing things. Is there a best practice or an approach to consider?
Well, I mean, I know Kai knows the answer to the legal side of it, but I'll say that, the interactive process has worked. So what a number of companies are doing is, they're creating a centralized accommodation fund. So first of all, so that the accommodations are funded out of, like a working capital fund where everybody pays in a percentage. So that's the first thing. The second thing is usually people know what they need. And I'm saying usually because sometimes they don't, especially if they acquire a disability, through an accident. And I think, there's, you want to have a conversation. Typically, at least lately, accommodations you're not dealing with your manager directly about your accommodations. If the company's big enough, you're dealing with an accommodations person or expert. Sometimes I don't think it's so good to have your manager in the middle of your accommodations request for lots of reasons. But if you're not getting along at the time, there's there's a sense from managers, I guess, sometimes that if your accommodation is expensive, even if it's not coming out of their budget, there's a sense that, it's too much. So I think separating the process and having the employee deal with somebody specifically trained to do that is really important. Anyway, I'll stop because I know we're almost out of time. Hi.
Yeah, and the common sense answer that you've described also lines up with the legal requirements. So let me just say, I do think it's useful to think about the difference between a large organization, like maybe a large philanthropic foundation, versus a small organization like a grantee. Okay, so large organizations, absolutely having a centralized accommodation fund is really helpful. So people don't feel like it's coming out of my budget, which is really going to create a disincentive to hiring someone who might need that type of accommodation. But even in a smaller organization where it might all be the same budget, it's really about thinking ahead of time when you figure out your budget to make sure that you're putting money for accommodations that you might need. So again, it's thinking about society, the norm of society, as including people with disabilities who will need accommodations. So of course you should plan ahead of time in terms of your budget. Okay, so you have it. If you don't need to use it that year, then you don't, but just thinking ahead. All right. And then the other thing is, obviously it's never, oh, my aunt has that disability and she would need this accommodation to do it, so here's the accommodation. It's like, no, the law says you have an interactive process with the person. Now, if the person says, here's the only accommodation I would accept, but there's another accommodation that would in fact achieve the same goal, the employer can say, sorry, here's the one I'm offering. So the law requires, this is a level set expectations on both sides, right? The law requires that the employer provide an accommodation that will be effective and not an undue hardship on the employer. So understanding that you need the interactive process to figure out what that accommodation should be.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been such an incredibly rich conversation, and we're getting close to time, but I can't let either of you go before I ask this one last question, which is, given your incredible experiences in the corporate sector and in the government sectors, what is the one last piece of advice that you want to leave our audience with, especially for those who are just getting started on their disability inclusion journey? And I will start with Chai. Will you kick us off for this final question?
I think the one thing you should take is that you need the fire in the belly to make this happen. Okay. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Culture does not change overnight. Just have the fire in the belly to be strategic, intentional, and persistent.
Hear, hear. And I would just say, but in addition to being strategic, jump in. Just, don't be afraid to ask questions. But again, you got to start by hiring somebody who is a person with a disability, because the fear of doing it wrong will keep people from doing it at all, and we want to change that.
You're here.
Beautiful, beautiful. So let's stay fearless. Let's keep that fire in our bellies, and let's just jump into hiring and learn from the experience. I am so moved by your comments in this conversation. I think that both of you are so incredible, and this conversation, like I said, has been so rich. I feel like I've learned so much from the both of you. Sincerest of thanks to you both, Cathy and Chai, for your time, your openness, for sharing your wisdom and your lessons so fully. It's been such an honor to moderate this insightful conversation. And thank you. I just wanted to say that super sincerely. And I wonder if Emily, if you might want to come back on to officially close us out. And with that, I will say thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
This is Emily, and adding to the thanks, and fill out the survey. Hi, Mona and Cathy. We will say goodbye now, and thank you so much.
Take good care.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.